We're currently still looking at the sections or letters to the churches, and if you would, we have been to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, and to Sardis. And this week we are at, if you would, Philadelphia. Okay, Philadelphia became the modern city of Al-Shahir in Turkey. It began as perhaps one of the first ancient cities, and possibly the first with the name of Philadelphia. So understand there were other ancient cities that bore the same name. But this particular Philadelphia we're referring to was established in 189 BC by King Eumenes II of Pergamum. Eumenes II named the city for the love of his brother, who would be his successor, Attalus II, whose loyalty earned him the nickname Philadelphos, literally meaning one who loves his brother. Then, lacking an heir, Attalus III, Philometor, the last of the Attalid kings of Pergamum, bequeathed his kingdom, including Philadelphia, to his Roman allies when he died in 133 BC. Rome established the province of Asia in 129 BC by combining Ionia and the former kingdom of Pergamum. According to the historian Pliny, Philadelphia was under the jurisdiction of Sardis during the first century, meaning it was a city of lesser importance in comparison to major centers such as Sardis, Ephesus, and Pergamum. Hang on to that. That will be important later. According to Strabo, the soil around the city was renowned, leading to the production of exceptional grapes and wine. Because the main industry was wine, it has been suggested by Dionysius that Dionysus was the main deity of the city. Yet the image of this god only appears on a few coins from Philadelphia, and none of them date to the first century, but they all date prior to that, to the first, second, and third centuries BC. Suetonius records that in 92 AD, Emperor Domitian issued an edict for the Asia province, which required many vineyards to be cut down and replaced with corn, which probably severely damaged the economy in Philadelphia. So consider that impact as well as we talk about things. So let's read through our text for today, and as we will go through it, we will get to know more about the city and see what Jesus is referencing and alluding to as he encourages the church at Philadelphia and the church down through the ages. And so we pick up with Revelation chapter 3, verse 7. To the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. I know that you have little strength, yet you have kept my word, and have not denied my name. I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars. I will make them come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. Since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I will also keep you from the hour of trial that is going to come on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming soon. Hold on to what you have so that no one will take your crown. The one who is victorious, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. And I will also write on them my new name. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The first thing to notice is that just like Smyrna, Jesus has nothing against the church at Philadelphia. Doesn't list any things, doesn't say, but I've got this against you. They're a faithful church. And so Jesus is giving them encouragement during the horrific times that this faithful church is facing under the rule of Domitian. And so he begins, if you would, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. Just in this short verse, there are several things we need to look at in order to understand what Jesus is telling the church at Philadelphia. And so if you would, these are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. Why is this important? This is a direct reference to an Old Testament event and a prophecy, and it is also connected to Revelation. These are all connected. If you would, we read in 2 Samuel, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought, "David cannot get in here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies. That is why they say, the lame and blind will not enter the palace. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward. And let's get a little more information in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, if you would. David and all the Israelites marched to Jerusalem, that is Jebus. The Jebusites who lived there said to David, "You will not get in here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. David had said, whoever leads the attack on the Jebusites will become commander-in-chief. Joab, son of Zeruiah, went up first, and so he received the command. David then took up residence in the fortress, and so it was called the city of David. So, how are these two passages connected to what Jesus is saying to the church at Philadelphia? Well, let's fill in what we know historically that isn't spelled out in the passages. In 2 Samuel, there is the obvious taunting back and forth. David calls the people inside the fortress the blind and the lame, and they haul back and they say, well, the blind and lame can keep you out. But there's something else that David had said when he called them lame and blind. That is important to our study that requires some historical background. So if we look again at 2 Samuel 5, verse 8, just the first part, says, on that day David had said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach the lame and blind, who are David's enemies. The first half of what he says is important, and that is, if you would, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft. Why is that important? Well, in ancient times, including the first century when Revelation was written, a fortress like that would have an iron gate, and the gate would be reinforced with bars. The bars would be kept from moving with a bolt, and a lock would prevent the bolt from being removed by an unauthorized person. The one who was responsible for the gate key would wear it on his shoulder. Anyone with the key could unlock and remove the bolt, move the bars to the disengaged position, and open the gate wide. Then once the gate was open, the lock could be replaced without the bolt to prevent the gate from being closed again. Joab, who was leading the attack according to 1 Chronicles 11, had the challenge of getting into the fortress unnoticed, finding the individual with the key, overpowering him, and then unlocking the gate, still unnoticed. David told him how to get in, if you would, by using the water shaft. So, what's he mean by that? Well, if you would. This is a diagram of the water supply system under Jerusalem at that time. The water system under Jerusalem was extensive, but if you would, the shaft leading up to the city was small and went straight up. The sides were smooth, carved stone. And the shaft, if you would, reaches down to a feeder tunnel. And the feeder tunnel, if you would, reaches to the Gihon Spring. And then you have an underground tunnel system, if you would, leading to the shaft. From here, they could draw water from the spring and carry it back up into the city. And so the challenge would be to climb up this smooth stone shaft and then enter the city through the tunnel without being seen. So Joab would have climbed the water shaft, found the one responsible for the key, and overpowered him silently so that he wouldn't get caught, then gone to the gate unnoticed to open it from the inside. Once the gate was open, the entire Israelite army would be able to enter the fortress and subdue the stronghold of Zion. The key to the gate became known as the key of David. The key of David was the key to the gate of the stronghold of Zion. When Joab scaled the water shaft, obtained the key, unlocked the gate, and then opened the gate of Zion from the inside, he enabled David and his troops to enter and take the stronghold of Zion. David took the key in hand and called Zion the city of David. That fortress became his residence and capital city. You see, if you would, the key to Zion represented the key to the governmental authority. And once David had it, it represented the governmental authority over the Davidic kingdom and would become known as, if you would, the key of David. We find that in Revelation. Now, let's look at a prophecy concerning that key and the Messiah. If you would, Isaiah chapter 22. In that day I will summon my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and fasten your sash around him and hand your authority over to him. He will be a father to those who live in Jerusalem and to the people of Judah. I will place on his shoulder the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. Does that sound familiar? Sound like what we've just read in Revelation a little bit ago? God rebukes and demotes Shebna, the steward, in verses 15 through 19 of that chapter, and then fills his office with his servant Eliakim. This passage is not only a record of God replacing Shebna, it is also prophetic. And Jesus makes direct reference to Isaiah 22:22 and Revelation 3, if you would, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, write, "These are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." He holds the key of David. He has complete authority over all things. Including, if we go back to Revelation chapter 1, if you would, I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. He has the key of David. He has the keys to death and Hades. He has authority over all things. And you see in the Isaiah passage, if you would, the name Eliakim means whom God raises up. Whom God raises up. And so Jesus is saying in Revelation that He is the one God has raised up, and He has complete authority, and no one can interfere with that authority. Jesus claimed that authority even before He ascended. Can anyone tell me where He did that? I might ask questions like this quite often. Get you to think about what you know about Scripture. Can anyone tell me where He claimed that authority? Maybe just the book. It's a very familiar passage. If you would, Matthew 28:18. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Even then, without directly saying it, on that day, Jesus was telling the disciples that He had been given the key of David. But it's not until the book of Revelation that we are shown that connection. So, why that connection now? Well, let's pick up at verse 8 of chapter 3. "I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. I know that you have little strength, yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name." Notice he says, if you would, I know that you have little strength. See, the church in Philadelphia is struggling. They are probably a very small church with very few resources and very little influence. Hence, Jesus is saying that He knows that they have little strength. He knows they're struggling. And yet, they have remained faithful and preached the whole gospel in the midst of this struggle. And in the context of what he is saying, his statement, "See, I've placed before you an open door that no one can shut," has a twofold connection to what's going on. First, remember we talked about the earthquake in 17 BC that destroyed Sardis. There were actually 12 famous cities in the region that were destroyed. Philadelphia was also one of the cities destroyed, although probably not one of the famous 12. Pergamum, Laodicea, and Hierapolis were also nearly leveled. Unlike these other cities, Philadelphia had an ongoing problem as a result. Even though it was not completely destroyed, as were many others in the regions, tremors continued to plague Philadelphia for decades afterward. Seismic events became so frequent that they were considered a normal part of life. Philadelphia was still experiencing these tremors at the time Revelation was written and sent to the churches, and it continued well beyond into the 2nd century. Greek historian Strabo wrote of the event about 3 years after it occurred. In the geography of Strabo, he states that the city was, if you would, subject to constant earthquakes. He thought it strange that Philadelphia would choose to live in such a place. But then, don't we kind of think the same thing about Californians with all the earthquakes going on there, and yet they still stay right there, even though people keep saying eventually California is going to drop off into the ocean. It's just a matter of time. Or maybe those that live at the foot of volcanoes. You ever wonder who in the right mind would live at the foot of a volcano? And yet some of the largest cities in the world at the foot of volcanoes, like Mexico City. And actually, most of us probably think it's worse than strange. But pay close attention to what he continued saying and think about what Jesus just said. So Strabo continues, if you would. The walls of the houses are incessantly opening, and sometimes one, sometimes another part of the city is experiencing some damage. See the connection? They never knew from one day to the next if there would be an opening in a wall or if it would be closed. They never knew from one day to the next if the door would work or if it wouldn't. They lived in constant uncertainty. And even though the tremors had become commonplace, they were still a reminder that the region was geographically unstable and another massive earthquake was possible. And in that context, Jesus is telling them, in Him, they have stability. He is eternally the same. If you would, He is the unchanging God who has authority over all things. And because He is the unchanging God, if you would, those who are faithful do not need to fear the present or the future. Not only are they probably a small church with few resources or very little influence, they are also being persecuted. We pick up in verse 9 of Revelation. I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars. I will make them come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. Jesus has referred to the Jews who are of the synagogue of Satan before and how they persecuted the church. Very little is known about the buildings and layout of Roman period Philadelphia. The few remains there are of a theater that's been discovered, and coins that near the end of the 2nd century AD indicate an imperial temple was probably erected there. But there's no evidence that in the 1st century there was any official presence of the imperial cult, and no indication that there were any major pagan temples in Philadelphia during that time. The absence of the imperial cult or any major pagan temples may have contributed to less persecution of the church at Philadelphia from the pagans, which would explain why Jesus' comments seem to indicate that the primary persecution came from the Jews who are of the synagogue of Satan. And if the church is a small one, the persecution can be quite intense. You know the saying, if you would, there's strength in numbers. The greater the number of Christians who are meeting together, the greater their strength spiritually, and the greater their influence in the community, particularly when facing intense persecution. And so Jesus' words, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut, takes on an additional application. Remember, Jesus has nothing bad to say about them. They are being faithful, even though they are being persecuted by the Jews. They are preaching the whole gospel and making disciples. They are doing their good works with an evangelistic emphasis. They are keeping the main thing the main thing. But they are being persecuted by the Jews and also the Romans probably, but not as much. They are facing stiff opposition to the gospel message. The Jews and the pagans are trying to stamp out the little influence they do have. In other words, if you would, they are trying to close the door on the gospel message. It's a difficult situation, but they have chosen to stay and stand firm for Christ. It would be easy to give up and go somewhere else, especially since the region is constantly having tremors and small earthquakes. But Jesus saying, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut, is telling them, if you would, don't give up. Keep preaching the whole gospel, because there will be those who will listen and respond to the message. Jesus had said essentially the same thing to the Apostle Paul in Acts 18, if you would. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on preaching. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. Paul was to keep preaching because Jesus had opened the door for the gospel to be preached, because there were many who would listen and respond to the gospel. Jesus was going to protect him so that the message would continue to be proclaimed. And that same type of protection appears to be what Jesus is referencing, if you would, in Revelation 3:10. Since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I will also keep you from the hour of trial that is going to come upon the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. They have possibly been thinking of just leaving. It's getting tough. Jesus had told the church at Smyrna the persecution was going to get worse. But Jesus is telling the church at Philadelphia to stay. There's a door or window of opportunity for the spread of the gospel. No, he doesn't say the persecution they are experiencing will go away, but rather he will protect them from what is coming. Also note, he follows up his promise to keep them safe with, if you would, I am coming soon. Hold on to what you have so that no one will take your crown. I'm coming soon. He said that before. He is about to judge Domitian. As we've already looked at, before this year was out and when Revelation was written, Domitian would fall. Is this an end-time message? No. Let's go back to Smyrna in Revelation chapter 2. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Remember what we said about the suffering persecution for 10 days? What we were just talking about. The reign of Domitian was about to come to an end. And Jesus' words to Philadelphia are a reference to that. Domitian's reign of terror is about to come to an end because Jesus is about to judge him. Revelation 2:10 and Revelation 3:11 are talking about the same thing. Domitian's reign is about to end because Jesus is going to come in the persons of those who assassinate Domitian and uses them to carry out his judgment against Domitian. But as that event gets closer, the persecution against the church is going to increase, as we have already pointed out, and when we looked at the section to Smyrna. Remember I told you to hang on to Pliny, implying that Philadelphia wasn't a very important city to the Romans? Jesus' protection of Philadelphia probably came in the form of the Romans also seeing the small church in Philadelphia as being insignificant and therefore ignored them and pursued the larger, more influential churches first to use them as an example. Even though Christ was protecting them, The church at Philadelphia may have been insignificant to the Romans, but not to Jesus. The days, weeks, months ahead were going to be turbulent for everyone everywhere in the empire. Not only was Domitian going to be assassinated, his successor was only going to last for a year. And his successor was a weak ruler, and his reforms were going to cause additional upheaval and financial chaos. That sound a little bit familiar? But Jesus used the insignificance of Philadelphia to the Romans and the church there to protect them when the persecution increased and when he judged Domitian. So he tells them he is coming soon to judge and not to give up no matter what happens, and don't give in, but rather, if you would, remain faithful. Revelation 3:12 we read, "The one who is victorious I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. And I will also write on them my new name." Words of encouragement and assurance. There are several allusions here as well. If you would, "The one who is victorious I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it." These words have several connections. First, if you would, the temple of my God. We must understand what he is referring to. One of the problems that we have with people, with this end-time stuff going around, they look at the Scriptures and they think of temple, and they don't look at what Jesus is actually talking about when he's talking about a temple. They're looking for this third temple to be built. Well, it actually would be the fourth temple for anyone who knows how to count historically. It wouldn't be a third temple, it would be a fourth temple. And we find out that when we get over to the New Testament, once we get beyond the book of Acts, the temple takes on a whole different connotation. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple." And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, "What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my temple." You see, we are the temple of God, the people, if you would, the church. So Jesus is saying the one who is victorious will be made a pillar in the temple of God, or the church. Does that mean they will be a leader? No. Then he follows that statement with, if you would, "Never again will they leave it." Jesus is referring to eternal permanence in the church. And if you would, in Matthew 16:18 we read, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." He is that rock, the eternal foundation of the church, firm and steady. See, they're living in a time of uncertainty. Small earthquakes and tremors are common. Buildings are constantly being damaged or destroyed. There's persecution, political turmoil. But in the temple of God, there is security and permanence. They will be a pillar because the church will not be shaken. So remain faithful. Be victorious, if you would, because nothing can stand against Christ and His church. Christ's church, God's holy temple, will not be destroyed by the events of the time or the persecution. It will remain throughout all generations and will stand forever. And when he says that I will make them a pillar in the temple of my God, he is giving them assurance that they do not need to fear the uncertainties around them, because the church will stand. The church will not fall. It is the kingdom of God. Like we have seen several times in the book of Daniel and the allusions here in Revelation, kingdoms and kings will rise and fall. But if you would, the kingdom of God and its king will endure forever. And Jesus continues, if you would, I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God, and I will also write on them my new name. Remember that everything in Revelation is connected. And we're being given a visual here. And it is a visual that we'll see later in Revelation. We'll talk about it at length then. But everything we have just talked about is critical to that visual, which we will see later. So like I say, I'm going to save that for later. And we will come back to it and discuss it at length. But I hope you're beginning to see why it is crucial to not just read, but study the Old Testament, especially the prophets, in order to properly understand Revelation and what Jesus is telling us. Because without that knowledge, everything gets confusing. Because the imagery that John draws on and the events and prophecies from the Old Testament writings and the direct connections to them gives us the insight into what Jesus is telling the seven churches and to all churches throughout all generations. Jesus repeated admonition, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches, is telling us to wake up and pay attention. Read carefully and be discerning. Think carefully about what is being said and what is happening in our day and age. Make the connections so that you understand. Because the reality is, there really isn't much of anything secret or hidden in Revelation to those who have studied the Scriptures and recognize the connections, not just to the Old Testament, but to us today. Revelation is only confusing when we don't know the rest of the Scriptures. And I think that's one of the problems that we see going on in Christendom today, is that people have a tendency to not look at the Old Testament. We think, well, this is New Testament time, so why should we look at the Old Testament? Because so much of the New Testament is connected to the Old Testament. That's how we understand what's being talked about. And so it makes sense that the references in Revelation are almost completely references to the Old Testament, because at this point, the New Testament canon hasn't even been compiled. I mean, think about it. We gather on a Sunday morning, we can open up our Bibles or put it up on the screen, and we go straight to the New Testament. And if we were to walk into Philadelphia, Smyrna, any of these other churches, we say, well, get out your New Testament. They say, what? What are you talking about? See, during this period, the letters we have which make up our New Testament canon are floating around from church to church. And many churches may have only seen one letter. Others may have not even received a letter yet. But they all have access to the Old Testament writings. There are so many ministers today that think that we can't preach Christ without focusing on the New Testament. Then how in the world did the Apostle Paul and the other apostles preach Christ when they didn't have the New Testament? When we begin to understand the connection of the Old Testament to the things we find in the New Testament, we begin to realize those things help us to understand more thoroughly what's being talked about. And so Jesus tells us in Revelation 3:13 again, if you would, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Twice now we have seen Jesus say that the things that were happening and about to happen were Him pronouncing judgment. Our world is so very similar to the world that the church faced in the first century. Wars, natural disasters, pandemics, runaway inflation. Yes, they had it during that period of Revelation. Persecution resulting in churches compromising. Many churches closing the doors, some being eradicated. Perhaps we should step back and take a good look at everything going on in the world today in light of what Jesus said to the churches in Revelation. Not looking for end times clues, but rather compare now to then and discern what is really happening. Understand that when Jesus told the church, I am coming soon, He wasn't talking about end times, and He could very possibly be doing the very same thing today, coming soon, but not in the way we were looking for Him. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Like we said at the beginning of going through this section of the letters to the churches, the task that is given us is to look at all of these sections, step back, and say, how do these apply to us? How do these apply to our day and age? Are there parallels? Similarities? Which church are we of the seven? Next week we're going to look at the last section of the letters, what are referred to as the letters of the churches, which I don't like that reference because the whole thing is a letter to the churches, not just these two chapters. But one of the things I have discovered is the passage we are going to be looking at next week, more than any other passages I have ever preached on, require a historical and geographic understanding of what was going on in order to understand what's being talked about. Because it is a passage that most of us know parts of it by heart. We've heard it over and over again. But yet when we understand the historical and geographic, we find out we've missed something. And I think one of the things that I have been discovering as going through these letters is that there's so much there that is misunderstood simply because the archaeological information has not been applied. And we miss the message that's really there. I think perhaps Jesus is trying to tell Philadelphia, I've opened the door. Don't be afraid to follow where I lead you. And I'm leading you right back into the community that's persecuting you. And I'm holding that door open because there are those there that will respond. Don't be afraid. Remain faithful. You'll be a pillar in the temple of God. And its foundations will not be shaken. Yes, I understand that everything around you is in turmoil constantly because you've got the constant tremors and earthquakes going on, but in the temple of God, it will be firm. It will be steadfast. And you will have no reason to run away in fear. Just follow where I lead. What door has he opened for you? I'm sure there's a door being held open for each of us. We simply need to remain faithful, follow him. Are you prepared to let him show you that door that he has? So that you can go into the community and reach those he brings to you.